Welcome to Ideas Through Time, where we explore the thoughts of history's greatest Western philosophers. I'm Zach Agoff, your host, here to make the transformative power of philosophy accessible to all. To start this episode, I thought we could begin with a thought experiment. So let's imagine that you and I form a kind of deal with one another. Let's say that we agree that I'll continue making these Ideas Through Time episodes if you give me $50 a month for the indefinite future. After forming the agreement, you make your first payment, expecting 4 episodes to be uploaded every subsequent Monday morning. After a month passes, I haven't uploaded any of the videos that I promised. Now, the second month begins, and you decide not to pay the $50 that you'd promised to pay. When I see that you haven't paid, I decide to reach out and say, hey, you broke the agreement that we made. A dispute would thus break out for obvious reasons because I didn't hold up my end of the bargain. So, what's wrong with this scenario? I think it's pretty obvious that because I broke the agreement, it's void. The agreement we made is void, and you aren't obligated to pay the second month and should be refunded the first month. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to do this to you. For one thing, to become a Patreon member for Ideas Through Time and support this show, it's only $5 a month, not 50. So if you do want to support the channel, it would be greatly appreciated. You can subscribe at patreon.com/ideas through time. But more importantly, this example does illustrate an essential point about contracts or agreements. Specifically, that agreements made between people are based around or made legitimate by a kind of trust that exists between the two parties. When I make commitments to other people, especially if they're strangers or merely instrumental commitments that I'm making, like when I make, you know, purchase items or trade goods or services with another person, I need to feel confident that they will hold up their end of the bargain. If I find that they aren't able, then the agreement that we're making is void. I don't owe them any money for whatever product I'm getting from them if they can't supply me the product. So I would no longer be required to hold up my end of the agreement either. But what if the agreements we were making weren't about trivial amounts of money? What if, to return to the example we considered in the previous episode, we were a part of a 20-person group that had been shipwrecked on a desert island? In this context, we might be making agreements with others in the group to actually help aid in our survival. We might, for instance, agree that you can work on building a shelter while I go fishing, and whatever fish I catch, I'll share equally with you. In return, I get to sleep in the shelter that you built. But in secret, I eat the bulk of the fish, or maybe even all of the fish that I catch, and I conceal that fact from you. I would get to benefit then from a surplus of food and a roof over my head while you starve, though you also have a roof over your head. Situations like these could quickly end up violent if our lives were truly, truly on the line. Now, how can this group of castaways solve this problem of individuals breaking agreements in favor of their own self interest? How can the castaways mitigate potentially violent scenarios between individuals? While there are probably many ways to approach this problem, at least one possible solution among those many would be to appeal to a strong authority figure that could exert some degree of control and persuasion over every individual in the group in order to make sure that everybody is following through on their agreements. If we assume that people will always pursue their own self interest, then the authority figure would have to emerge as the most powerful of the group, taking a position that makes it in everyone else's own interest to follow through on the agreements that they're making with others. That is, if you break your agreements, the consequence that this authority figure would bring would be so not in your interest that it is in fact more in your interest to just, keep your word. So, welcome to the wonderful world of Hobbesian political logic. Yes, the topic of today's episode is the political thought of Thomas Hobbes, who argues that the only way to guarantee that we can be kept from a state of all out war with one another is to submit ourselves to an absolute political authority who can ensure the fulfillment of agreements and contracts that are being made between individuals in the society. Welcome then to Ideas Through Time. So let's back up a little bit. As I see it, the job of a historian of philosophy is to show empathy, at least to the best of our ability, to the historical figures that we're considering. Indeed, even in contemporary philosophy, people often talk about something called the principle of charity. That is, when we engage with the arguments proposed by other people, our interlocutors or our philosophical opponents, even when we disagree with the view that they're promoting, we ought to engage with the best possible interpretation that we can give on behalf of our interlocutor or opponent. So even if our opponent is offering a pretty weak view or weak argument for their philosophical view, it's best for us to present a better version, or ideally the best version we can of the view than what is actually given by the other person. But why is this? There are a couple reasons, I think. First, when we argue against the less than best version of a philosophical view, that is a weak version of it, we aren't actually demonstrating that the best version of the view is actually false. We're just demonstrating that some weaker version is false. Intuitively, when we demonstrate that the best possible version of a view is false, we actually show that every weaker version of the view is false as well. And if this is true, then if we demonstrate a less than best version of a philosophical view to be false, then there are still stronger versions of the view that have gone unaddressed. The view we disagree with actually escapes our critique. I think that this principle of charity should apply to our treatment of historical figures as well. You can be sure, it's one thing I can guarantee you, that you'll come across views in history that need to be done away with. But in order to do this, we need to first engage empathetically and charitably. Hear the view for what it is. Understand the intuition driving the position. Indeed, one of my favorite philosophers, one of my favorite historical figures, Emily de Châtelet, says something along the lines of, every philosopher has seen something. It's our job then to find out what that contribution is, even if we disagree with the overarching view that's being defended. Find the kernel or the intuition that drives the philosophical system. This is especially important, I think, for a figure like Thomas Hobbes, at least in my experience. Hobbes, his ultimate view, is one that might be somewhat disturbing to our modern democratic eyes. Ultimately, he argues that it is in our interest to cede all political authority to an absolute monarch or sovereign or lone political figure. The power held by this sovereign is not to be shared amongst other political powers, but is to reign supreme over all of the people of the land. Now, Hobbes had some pretty intricate reasons for supposing that this is the most rational thing for individuals to do. But he has two primary aims, I think, in establishing the absolute authority of a sovereign. First, he wants to adopt a political scheme that will convincingly avoid civil war. He was indeed alive during the rather brutal English Civil War, where you had those defending the sovereign king, King Charles I, and then you had those defending the Parliament. Spoiler alert: the Parliament won. You had these two sides fighting in England, and it was very bloody, very brutal. And the viciousness of the Civil War, it deeply disturbed Thomas Hobbes. He was ultimately seeking a justification to avoid shared power between a parliament and a crown, or whatever political constitutions would share power, which would inevitably, in his eyes, lead to a kind of power struggle and ultimately more civil war. But he was interested in critiquing the reasons given for supporting an absolute sovereignty or monarchy. Before Hobbes, monarchies were primarily defended through something called divine rights arguments. This returns to one of the central questions of political philosophy. What makes a political authority legitimate? Or, in other words, what makes a political authority authoritative? Divine rights theorists This is exemplified in a person named Robert Filmer, for instance, who Hobbes was actually responding to. But divine rights theorists maintained that a monarchy is legitimate only insofar as it is given authority directly from God. So this suggests that political authority is subsumed in a certain sense under divine authority, or that political authority is authoritative just in case it is given authority by Heavenly Almighty. Now, Hobbes wasn't particularly impressed by this reasoning. He sought instead to establish secular, that is, non-religious, grounds for an absolute monarch, the specifics of which we'll get into in a moment. And just to be clear, when a person gives secular reasons for something rather than religious reasons, it's not that the person isn't necessarily, atheist or something. In Hobbes's case, that probably is true. He was probably an atheist, but even religious people can give secular reasons for some view that they have without relying on religious grounds. So, just a little methodological point there. Nonetheless, it's these secular reasons that Hobbes utilizes that made him so controversial during his own time. He was progressive in the sense that he moved away from religious justification for the monarchy, but he was rather conservative for being anti-parliament or any other form of government that with distributed shared power. So he wasn't really liked by the defenders of the parliament, and he also wasn't really liked by the defenders of the crown because he was a heretic. So in classic philosopher fashion, Hobbes was able to basically piss off every last person. And you'll see that becomes a theme. So Hobbes isn't just interested in establishing an absolute sovereign or king for no reason. He thinks it's the best way to avoid all-out civil war, and he has sophisticated secular reasons for thinking that it's the most rational political option available. Let's get into those secular reasons. I should note that we won't be going over his entire argument in just this video. I will be making a follow-up video to this one. This video sets up the problematic in something called the state of nature, and the following video that we'll get to next week wraps up that problematic, and the solution that Hobbes comes up with is this absolute sovereign point. So with that said, let's go ahead and move forward. The opening chapters of the Leviathan consider in particular the nature of humankind. Here, Hobbes gives us his philosophy of mind, his philosophy of cognition, his account of language, his account of the emotions, or, in the early modern era, the emotions were referred to as the passions. So those should be considered interchangeable terms, passions and emotions. Now, why would a book on political philosophy start here? Does it matter what the nature of humankind is like in order to know how to structure groups made of humans? Well, Hobbes thinks yes, and I think probably a lot of political philosophers think yes. In fact, he thinks that the nature of humans actually determines, in a sense, the kind of political makeup that fits them best. Now, some of you may be wondering, what do I even mean by the nature of humans? A human is just a human. What more is there to inquire about? Well, different philosophers think that humans are different things, that they're made up of different things or are constituted by different things. Some philosophers suggest that humans are humans insofar as they have an immaterial mind or an immaterial soul. Others suggest that humans are strictly material things made up only of inert, passive matter. Still others think that humans are both material and immaterial souls, joined together in some kind of unique way. This, of course, isn't an exhaustive list, but it does show that different philosophers have different ways of answering the question, what kind of thing is a human being? If you're interested in this question, feel free to drop a comment. I'd be curious to hear about your opinion. When you do, though, I would be impressed if you could leave your specific reasons for your specific position. Why is it that you think what you think? That's when we start getting involved in philosophy. Now, Hobbes is a bona fide materialist, meaning that he thinks that all that exists in the world is material, including humans. This view maintains that there's no immaterial or spiritual stuff out there, so to speak, but only matter in motion, material bodies operating according to physical laws. And if this is the case, then he has to be able to explain all of the capacities of the human in terms of materialism, and that includes, to some degree, political philosophy. Given this, Hobbes's project at the beginning of the Leviathan is to demonstrate the nature of social interaction between humans, given that we are nothing more than material bodies operating according to physical laws. We could easily get swept away here by a long discussion about Hobbes's account of sense perception, imagination, and reason, and how they can all be explained in material terms. But what is most important here is to actually look at Hobbes's account of the emotions, because there he's able to account, he thinks at least, for all of our voluntary actions or motions. Yes, Hobbes maintains that all voluntary motion, all the motion that we have, well, that we might usually call under our control, um, but all of the bodily movements that we will to occur, like raising our arm or dancing or hugging our partner or something along those lines, is perpetuated or caused by our appetites and emotions. Hobbes thinks that our decisions do not occur in a vacuum, but that our decisions depend upon emotional states caused by material bodies. In this sense, we are determined by our materiality to pursue things we see as good for us or avoid things that we see as bad for us. Call this view determinism. According to determinism, every action has a cause or a reason for its occurrence. Under this view, there is no free will per se, or action caused from a void or local source or something like a spirit, soul, or disembodied mind. Every action that we take is the effect of some previous cause. And Hobbes is suggesting that voluntary actions that we take as humans are the effect of some previous appetite or emotion. Now, Hobbes discusses a wide range of emotions, from emotions as fundamental as love and hatred to emotions as complex and tertiary as shame and cruelty. But Hobbes, as was the fashion in early modern philosophy, thought there were some emotions that were the most fundamental. And for him, the most fundamental emotions are to endeavor and to desire. He thinks that these are really the same thing, actually. To desire something is really just to endeavor for a determinate thing or to strive for a determinate thing. Um, that is like a specific thing or object. And so to endeavor then is basically just to desire without a determinate thing. There is no specific object being desired. It's just a kind of striving, an internal striving. All things that experience voluntary actions, like animals and humans, experience this striving to persevere and striving to attain the necessary goods for survival. Humans, however, are somewhat unique. Hobbes tells us that there is a general inclination of all mankind, a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. So, this internal endeavor that gets expressed as a desire in people is most often, Hobbes thinks, for humans, expressed as a desire for power. Hobbes suggests that this desire isn't merely a hope for some good that we might enjoy, like a desire to eat some chocolate cake or something. Rather, it's a general desire to attain the power necessary to have the means to live well and be protected against external threats. And this makes sense. One of the most common desires that we have is the desire to have enough to get through the day, enough to take care of our future selves, enough to feel some sense of safety for ourselves and family, some sense of security. However, as humans, when we start acquiring some sense of security, we're really good at starting to poke holes in that security system. What if somebody did this? Or what if somebody did that and put my family and myself under such and such threat? Acquiring some power thus leads to the desire to acquire more power. There's no upper limit here, Hobbes thinks. People will perpetually and restlessly pursue power until they finally die. He goes on to list a few other desires that may be important for future episodes, but for now, let's just turn to the consequences of Hobbes's account of human emotion. In chapter 13 of Leviathan, Hobbes presents his account of the state of nature. I briefly discussed the state of nature as it pertains to social contract theories in the previous episode, but I'll go ahead and jog your memory here. Or for first time listeners, hopefully this will serve as an explanation for what I mean by the phrase state of nature. Social contract theorists generally hold that a political authority is authoritative insofar as its constituents have consented or would consent to the political rule under such and such conditions. They defend this claim usually by inquiring into the conditions under which a political authority would emerge. That is, they try to paint a picture of what the social world would look like without a political authority in order to understand how and why such a political authority would be established in the first place. Call this painted picture of a pre political world the state of nature. Each of the early modern social contract theorists utilize it, but they envision it in strikingly different ways, leading to very significant differences in the political authority that they think we should be consenting to. Hobbes famously argues that in the state of nature, humans live in continual fear and danger of violent death, and that life is, quote, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Quite a pronouncement, no? But how does he actually get here? What pieces of Hobbes's political puzzle do we need to put together to understand why he thinks that without some kind of governing body, the conditions of life would basically be continual, all out war? Well, we need to back up a little bit here. At the beginning of this chapter, chapter 13, Hobbes gives us an argument that people are, by nature, generally equal in their capabilities. There might be subtle differences in strength and cunning, but humans tend to have a sufficient amount of strength to compete with one another, whether um, and also a sufficient amount of cunning to compete with one another. So maybe let's get into an example. For example, picture the strongest person that you can. I don't know, somebody like Dwayne the Rock Johnson or something. Uh, you could not picture someone as small as, for instance, Kevin Hart overpowering The Rock. The Rock is just too powerful to be overcome by such a significantly smaller enemy. However, this imbalance can be corrected through the cunning of Kevin Hart, poison, sneakery, the use of a weapon. These could all quickly level the playing fields or completely overpower and kill Dwayne The Rock Johnson. The same goes for someone who is exceptionally cunning. There will always be someone who can come along and, to be frank, kick their ass. So the playing field then is relatively equal. That said, even if a person were so powerful, both physically and intellectually, the lesser people could band together and overcome them, Hobbes thinks. There's simply no escaping the fact that we are vulnerable to other humans should the conditions be right. And for Hobbes, in the state of nature, the conditions are always right, actually. We could always be overcome by other people, whether by individuals or by a group that has banded together in order to better their odds of survival. Hobbes tells us that in the state of nature, if two people desire, remember how important that word is? If two people desire the same thing, they will compete with one another for it. And if they desire it enough, this could even lead to a fight to the death. So we're talking about acquiring the very goods necessary for survival here. So the desire to acquire these goods is going to be very strong. Additionally, Hobbes thinks that in the state of nature, necessary resources would actually be quite scarce. After all, the complex infrastructure that supports large populations of humans requires a great deal of cooperation, agreements, and contracts. There is no such cooperation for Hobbes in the state of nature. And so there would not be a complex infrastructure that could support large populations of humans. This would thus make it inevitable that different people would desire the same things, and it would thus lead to conflict, war, and ultimately death. Okay, so now we have the pieces to make sense of the larger picture. So let's unpack it. For Hobbes, humans are basically self-interested material beings that are determined to pursue their own interests in an attempt to maintain and expand their personal security in the world. In the state of nature, there are limited resources, which inevitably leads to conflict. This conflict ensures that no individual can secure absolute safety in the state of nature. That is, the state of nature is a state of all-out war. Now, what's interesting about this, as we'll see in our next episode, in the state of nature, it is pursuing our own interests that actually undermines the very interests we're pursuing. If we say that it is in our interest to acquire safety and prosperity, then in the state of nature, pursuing those things that give us safety and prosperity actually lead to a great degree of danger and ultimately our death. This is the great irony that Hobbes is drawing out here. We shoot ourselves in our own feet. We want safety, but in competing with each other based on our desires, we guarantee a life that is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. In our next episode, we'll explore how Hobbes escapes the state of nature through a social contract. In that episode, we're going to discuss some really interesting things about Hobbes's proto-game theoretic, the famous prisoner's dilemma, and why an absolute sovereign guarantees safety from the state of nature. So I hope to see you all there next time. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching the episode. Your viewership and support means so much. If you could like this video and subscribe to the channel, it would also mean a ton. If you care to contribute to the production of Ideas Through Time and want to become a member of our growing community, feel free to visit patreon.com/ideas through time and become a member. Once we get enough subscribers there, we'll begin to have monthly Zoom meetings and many other perks. So again, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.